Hi, it's Claire Wasserman, and welcome to my podcast, a behind the scenes look at what it really takes to own our worth and reach our goals. I coach real women on how to get what they want at work and in life, as well as a window into my own process as I too figure this stuff out, because it's hard. And so thank you for being here. It's nice to know that we're not alone. In this episode, you'll meet Summer, who recently got feedback at work that she's not speaking up enough in team meetings. She told me that she feels comfortable in smaller settings. In her words, it's more organic. But once there's more people, especially on Zoom, she just feels awkward to interject. We talk through what it means to have an executive presence grounded in authenticity. Because, in my opinion, the worst thing you can do is pretzel yourself into someone else in order to be successful. Just a note for all of you listeners, this session has been recorded with her consent and edited for clarity. If you're interested in being coached by me or simply have a question that you want answered, go to clairewasserman.com. Okay, let's dive in. You wrote in a couple of different things. Action items to level up my money mindset was one, executive presence was another, and self-advocating skills was the last one. We can obviously go in any direction that would feel most helpful to you. So you tell me what would have the most impact on the quality of your life, or what would have the biggest kind of domino effect in raising the level for you that you want to be at the end of our session today.
Yes, absolutely, Claire. I would love to focus on self-advocacy in general, and particularly with a focus on how to speak up and have that executive presence in larger team meetings. And I think there's a big distinction between smaller team meetings of that sweet spot of under 8 folks. And then in contrast with the larger team meetings, we're looking at upwards of 30 people or more. So how do you add your insights and really make a valuable impact on day one?
Awesome. Okay. So I like to work backwards from the negative. Okay, we'll start in a very depressing place and go with me here on this. What is stopping you from having the self advocacy and the presence that you want to have in the larger setting? Because you clearly have it in the smaller setting, I'm imagining, right? Inherently in the way that you ask the question, right? Smaller setting, you're feeling really confident. Something changes. What's happening?
I think this kind of differs from company to company. Specifically for my company, we're a remote first type of company. So a lot of my meetings are held over Zoom. And naturally, with Zoom, there's a little bit of a lag. There's folks that's interjecting, and sometimes folks are interjecting either via the chat function or just speaking up, raising their hands on Zoom. So that can be really difficult to find that nice insertion spot to just quickly, seamlessly integrate yourself and add feedback, especially if there's an open dialogue. That's a lot of going back and forth.
Yeah, totally. Because I was going to ask, what would be the difference if it was in person? Do you feel like you would be feeling the same way?
And for in person, you definitely have a lot of that body language. You know exactly when someone just pauses, takes a deep breath before continuing with their thoughts, rather than on Zoom, which is you don't really necessarily know if it's a full stop or if they're still trying to gather their thoughts before moving on to the next sentence.
Okay, so for all of that, which is correct, what does that do to you?
I think for someone like myself, I also spend a lot of time once I hear feedback or listen to other folks' insight, I like to take time to digest whatever I'm hearing and reflect and also just respond internally on how do I make of what they're saying. And between that period of digesting the feedback and also gathering my thoughts, we then move on to the next subject already. So that sweet spot of how to seamlessly also bring back folks back to that question that we were just talking about, I think is also a great sort of action step that I would love to get your feedback on as well.
When you are in these meetings, what's your level compared to the rest of the people in there?
My level would be I'm someone on the senior side,
Okay.
but definitely not on the leadership managerial side. A senior IC contributor.
And you're not typically leading the meetings, correct?
Not necessarily for the large team meetings, definitely not that. But for smaller meetings, yes, I have a very much equal voice, just like everyone else in the team.
Okay, great. I want to just bring up something to you that you brought up to me pre-record. You mentioned that you did get feedback from
Hmm.
somebody higher up who said to you something along the lines of, "You're doing great in smaller settings, wish you would speak up more in larger settings." I want to confirm that this isn't something that's just in your head, that you were told that you could do better in this area. Is that right?
So this is the first performance review that I've ever had. And the only feedback, and of course, there's a section on what could you do differently. There's always like a kind of a growth area section that your manager can chime in and express. And so the only thing that could have been done differently or an area to grow is sharing my input and suggestions on these larger team calls. And my manager think I have a lot to add and there are a lot of value to share and just great feedback and also prior institutional knowledge that it could be passed to this next company.
Yeah. How did that feedback make you feel?
I wholeheartedly agree that the feedback was valid.
Mhm.
And I definitely recognize that. I think for smaller settings, everyone, I would say, on my team are very vocal. We can just be ourselves and really fully express what's working, what's also not working. I think that sometimes can be really challenging to step up on the podium and also just articulate the things that we could be growing on
Mhm.
as a company, but also as a team.
Mhm.
In larger settings, naturally, the agenda is very different. You have an agenda, you have certain topics and devote it with time slots each. And so it's less of a, I would say, an open dialogue where you can just talk about any other subject that is on your mind, especially in the workplace. But in the larger team meetings, it's very much formal and structured, which makes it very difficult to have that organic discussion, especially about something that deviates from whatever the agenda is for
Mhm.
that day.
So interesting. When I hear formal and structured and you feeling like that's a negative, right? Because you thrive in the more organic setting, which is awesome. I had this little like moment where I realized for another person, it could be the complete opposite, that they would feel more comfortable if it's so structured because they know how to maneuver something that
Hmm.
is understood to be technically the same every time, right? If it's formal, if it's structured. Whereas organic, you never know what's going to happen. It's a bit spontaneous. You have to feel really comfortable to do improv in a way. So just to acknowledge that you actually have a skill set that is coveted by a lot of other people. And this is just a matter of understanding how the game is played and then just playing
Hmm.
and playing it. I want to confirm two things though. And I ask a lot of questions before I dive in because I want to make sure that we're diagnosing this all correctly. Do you feel confident in your ideas in these meetings? And it's just a matter of how to bring them up in a chaotic Zoom, slash, do you feel less confident about the ideas and you're also unsure how to insert yourself in the chaotic Zoom?
Yeah. I think personally for myself, I do not necessarily like the attention on me. So when it comes to a bigger, larger setting of 30 folks or more, and now you're the one raising your hand, hopefully in a seamless way, and sometimes maybe not in a seamless way over Zoom, it feels like the attention is on you to be able to come up with a very compelling idea, offer something of value, and in some ways even solve the problem rather than just identifying the problem. So there's a little bit of that.
Mhm.
And then in terms of the Zoom, even though there's a structured agenda, I think naturally with just async work and the little bit of a lag time, it makes it difficult to just take a moment and pause and say, can I add something to that?
Mhm.
Without deviating from the agenda and also preventing the team from ending early
Yeah.
as originally planned.
Okay, cool. All right. So there's two things here. There's the what do I say and the how do I say it. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Let's begin with the what do I say? This pressure to solve the problem. I am so glad that you bring this up because I know there are a lot of people out there listening and watching who feel the same way, both in a meeting, but also just in general, that every time they show up to work, there has to be this like level of, well, perfection, but it just needs to be like 100%, 100% of the
Hmm.
What I think our goal actually is here is to just move the ball forward, is to help solve the problem. So, what you contribute in that meeting and in your work life, it's a piece of the puzzle. It doesn't have to be the entire puzzle. So, when people are going on about whatever it is and you're racking your brain for what can I do to jump in and solve the problem for you, way too much pressure. That's too big. And of course, you're not going to come up with it. So, you're just going to be quiet. We cannot have that happen. We need you to say something, but that thing needs to be, of course, of value. And you made the good point of you don't want to just add to it by asking another question or just saying something for the sake of saying something, which so many people do. And that's why meetings tend to suck. So I would be curious if you could imagine maybe the last time you had this experience, you were in a meeting and you were putting this pressure on yourself, or a time that really just stands out to you, whatever the discussion topic was. What do you think that you could say that would not necessarily solve the problem, but offer a way of thought, an example, a puzzle piece that would help somebody else in the room, or in this case, the Zoom, solve the problem? Instead of thinking of yourself doing the slam dunk, you be the person who does the layup. I can't believe I'm doing any kind of sport metaphor here. What the hell is happening? But I think that visual will help you. So let's think of this in concrete terms. If you want to take a beat and try to remember a time in the past when you were in the meeting or projecting in the future, maybe there's something coming up. What could be a way that you would add to the conversation that doesn't solve the problem necessarily, but offers a next step towards getting to the solution? I can give, as you're thinking of this, I'll give you a few examples. So one could be, just want to interject for a second. This is really reminding me of a time at my last company, because I think you may be new since you mentioned that this was the first performance review you've had. So if it's not at this last
Yes.
company, so you might say, okay, my previous company, we were tackling something similar and we fill in the blank. So that would be an
Yeah.
example. That would be an example. Another one would be, and then I'll have you jump in and give me your ideas. Another one might be, just to play devil's advocate for a second, and I know that can be annoying to people, but let me just for devil's advocate, if we are thinking about solving it in this way, as we've been discussing in the meeting, that can take a lot of energy or time or what, like you might bring up maybe a drawback to the way that people have been discussing it. So just to play devil's advocate for a second, what would it be like if we, and then offer like an alternative? So what I'm doing here is really demonstrating to them how you think. Okay. This is you
Mm-hmm.
being transparent about Summer's problem solving skills versus the pressure of here's the solution in a bow. Unless
Yes.
that's what you're expected to do. And that's a whole other conversation. And we can talk about that. So, based off of what I just shared, tell me what you think, what you feel, if that resonates, and if those were good examples, and if there's any more that you can imagine that might make sense as, again, not doing the like slam dunk, but the layups for somebody else.
I love the way that you just approach that. I think it's a fine balance between, hey, I have something of value to add, but also I'm not here to solve the entire problem for you today. That this is something that could be a nugget of information, almost like a calibration point. It might work for this company and maybe it might not work for this company, right? I think another example that kind of jumps to mind is, and this came up recently, is I was discussing with another company, very similar in the industry that I'm currently in. And so we see a lot of crossover issues. And so I think one thing that I could potentially add is, hey, I noticed this company is also in the same industry and I see a lot of crossovers, and this is how they're executing this.
Mhm.
Or this is one way they're tackling whatever technology is at play today in today's realm.
And you just demonstrated how smart you are and that you do your research, you're tapped into the industry, you're noting competitors, right? You're thinking creatively. There's so much there. And then you're going to hear yourself say this and you're going to gain more confidence. And guess what? By the end of it, you will solve all of their problems. And then you're going to ask for a raise. Okay. So that's great. The other thing, some other tactics I like to integrate into executive presence and or just presence in general at meetings is, and I know you said you don't want to do this, but I'm still going to throw it out there. It is asking a question, but asking a really interesting one. I don't want that to put extra pressure on ourselves here, right? It has to be this like really smart question. But if the goal out of all of this is to demonstrate how we think, some of that means coming up with an idea, but sometimes that means asking a question because that still is in line with the layup analogy. Because when you ask an interesting question and maybe pose it specifically to somebody in the group, right? Referencing their name, then what I love about that is it gets other people to be involved and you become like the host of the
Mm-hmm.
conversation, the moderator of the conversation. And now the energy shifts to you. You are the focal point. However, it's without that pressure of performance, right? Everyone's looking at me and I have to deliver. No, everyone's looking at me because I'm asking an interesting question, posing it to this person. Then they have their 2 cents. And then maybe you jump in after that with that got me thinking, or here's my follow up, or based off of what John just said. And I also love using people's names in general. You really seem like you're in command when you do that. And you're also giving shout outs to them in a way, especially if there's another woman on the call or whatever, being able to say, hey, Caitlin, great idea. I really love what you had mentioned earlier today. It really got me thinking, how about we, and then pose a question, right? So now Caitlin, whoever, she's like, oh, I'm so flattered. You thought I had a good idea. She feels involved. So you, as this kind of host of the meeting now, the improv host, you
Mm-hmm.
are, I don't know, you just became the leader. Like that is the executive presence, and you did it in a really inclusive way. So it's funny, I always feel more comfortable being the moderator actually of panels than I often am like the panelist. Maybe it's a control thing so that you never feel like, oh, is somebody going to call on me? No, if you are now thinking of yourself as the person who actually calls on everyone else, not calls
Uh-huh.
out, but calls on, it changes the dynamic and puts you more, in my opinion, the driver's seat, but without the pressure. I don't know how if that would work for you. Tell me if that's resonating, how you could imagine it making sense for your situation.
I love that just because when you said that, I already envisioned myself stepping into the driver's seat and taking some sort of control back in some ways and helping navigate the conversation, but also making it just as inclusive, adding feedback, and also condensing, hopefully, some of the feedback that I've collected from across multiple of people. The other thing that I jumped out to me is, for example, if a team member comes to a larger team call and says, hey, I'm working on this really exciting project and this is what I'm doing. This is the project that I'm leading that's adding to the bottom line. And one of the questions that just popped up in my mind was, walk me through some of the trade-offs that you had to tackle, and also why did you go with X and not Y, and help me understand what were some of the considerations that were important for the business. And I think also shifting it to the business rather than just the team or them specifically takes the pressure off of them as well.
Amazing. Yeah. Things like, what was the hardest part about that? If you did it again, how would you do it better? Yeah, so now you're asking questions, but everyone is witnessing, they see why you're asking those questions, right? So now you're eliciting more information from them. Everyone's hearing your voice as well. And then you might come up with something based off of how they're responding to you. The other thing I wanted to mention based off of what you said is a concern of yours that I actually see as a strength and how we can pull that forward. A concern you it sounded like was there's so much that's being said, you're digesting it and you want to be able to thoughtfully contribute, right? But it's this like rapid digestion that's like the friction point here. Why that's a strength is the desire to be thoughtful, right? That's clearly a strength. It takes you a minute to be thoughtful. Great, as it should. Like time is a necessary element in all of this. How do we make this work for you instead of work against you? The thoughtfulness or the thing that comes naturally to you here that's like being a tension point. I'm going to make a suggestion. You tell me how you feel. What if you are taking some notes and then you are sharing those notes as the meeting is going on? So this could be more in the chat function than you speaking up, but you could also do it by unmuting yourself. For example, based off of what people are saying, you might want to jump in and say, okay, I just want to confirm based off of what's been said so far or what John just mentioned, here are 3 next steps that we are going to take. Something like that. So I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting you become the note taker for the meeting. This is a position that a lot of women get relegated to. Either they're put on that task or they self volunteer because they think it's going to make them look good. And there's research that shows actually that it doesn't. And it takes away from their executive presence because instead they look like they're the executive assistant. In the suggestion I just made, and I want to make it clear, this is not about you taking notes for the meeting, but about you articulating that you have taken some notes for a certain purpose and you posit it forward either for confirmation or asking somebody to add on or whatever. So, based off of that suggestion, tell me how you think or feel. Does that resonate? Would that work for you?
I think with the exactly what you mentioned about with Zoom, sometimes we have a hard stop and we're just moving from one agenda item to the next. And I think one way for me to also ensure that I got the message right is, did I get this correctly? And put whatever the comment I heard, and I wanted some sort of confirmation, especially if there's numbers involved or anything with an action item or some sort of deadline. I think that's also really important. But also, did I get this right? That the next step that you're thinking about from more of like a team perspective, this is where you would like the team to move.
Yes. Yeah. And I love that because it shows that it's not just about you, like you're a team player, that you care about the business. You don't want to waste people's time with just talk. It needs to turn into action. That was something I loved about how you wrote in your question to me, which was you desired action items. Okay. A lot of people, they just want inspiration. And I'm always like, okay, that's like maybe the first step, but what are you going to actually do with the inspiration? You expressing this to people that this is a value of yours and also a strength. This is not a solution. It's just an expression. And the whole point of all of this and the feedback that you got, people want to hear what you have to say, but also they want to hear what you have to say because they want to learn from you. Ultimately, that's what this is, right? A group of people coming together to learn from each other to make the business better. So if we break down these meetings into those components, imagine yourself, what is your strength in terms of what you can teach others in this meeting? And sometimes that teaching is offering a solution, maybe, but I'll bring it back to me for a second. Coaching, great coaching. If I'm just giving out solutions to people, they actually don't really learn that much. They have to participate in the process in order for it to really sink in. So I think this is transferable to you in these meeting settings of, all right, when I'm coming into them, how can I teach others, right? What can I deliver to them that makes us all learn together and grow faster in service of the business? So I think when we shift it that way, A, it takes the pressure off, but B, it will allow you to really reflect on Summer's strengths as, I'll just say, a teacher or a guide, helping others learn, again, to impact the business. What do you do? Forget about the meeting for a second, but just in general, where do you feel like your strengths most lie when you think of it in terms of that kind of filter? So if the contribution to these meetings is going to be you helping others to learn and thinking about what the value you bring to the workplace just in general, if you had to maybe pick 3 words, let's say, you can take a beat to think about them. What might they be? The reason I'm asking this question is you knowing those for yourself, then we can brainstorm how does that get expressed in a meeting setting and also before and after as well, because that's important. So you being totally clear with yourself about your brand here, your ethos, your process, your methodology of the work that you do.
Yeah. So when I think of that, I automatically think actively listening.
Uh-huh.
I think of curious. So
Mm,
when I'm saying curious, it's I want to look under the hood. I want
mm,
to get into the details. And on the flip side to that is I also want to see how this plays a part in the bigger picture of whatever
mm, mm.
the team or the business is working on. For me, I want to go, 10,000 feet high, just as much as I want to go so close to it that I want to get all the details. And just because of that curiosity of how would we actually solve the situation or the problem, and what are some of the components that we need to be thinking about and considerations, and who do we need to pull in? And so that's where my mind goes to when I'm in these meetings.
Great. I love that. So knowing these are things that you are naturally very good at and you value about yourself, preparing for the next meeting, the best way to probably do that is to remember the last meeting you had, or maybe even the hardest meeting you've had. How could you have expressed those things about yourself in that meeting. So even just brainstorming, and we've already done that already today a little bit, but this would be good, maybe homework for you, is based off of active listening and being curious, getting under the hood. How can those get manifested? Very specifically, come up with exactly what you will say, both verbally and then also in the chat, that demonstrates those skills about yourself. Like, how do you express active listening if in a Zoom?
I think just third way of active listening that's widely known is just parroting it back what the speaker is saying. So once the speaker has said something, parrot it back in terms of what you think you heard. Did I get that right? And also to get under the hood, now that I'm weaving this other second part to it, is can you share maybe a living document or a dynamic document that's subject to change about what you're working on in terms of either an FAQ or the thought process or whatever went into the project and asking it from that perspective, almost doing like a twofer. Yeah. And then thinking, how does this also now help us to the bottom line or our next company wide RKO?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that great. Amazing. I'm loving this. By the way, for everyone listening and watching, there's research out there that talks about how meetings are not where decisions get made. Okay. It's really before and after that's most important. Meetings are quite performative or can be. So you want to make sure before the meeting, as best as you can, you are very clear on the agenda. Who's going to be there? What's going to be discussed? So you're already coming in with ideas, right? And again, let's take the pressure off of trying to solve anything, but you'll have some talking points already ready to go. So you'll be a little bit more excited rather than nervous. Also, does there need to be conversations happening before the meeting? There's a meeting before the meeting. So there are people who are getting together who are going to be talking to each other about how they're going to be contributing to the meeting. And that's why you can sometimes see people really dominating. It's not just their personality, but they literally had a conversation with somebody about how they're going to come in and dominate the meeting. So try to think about, is there anybody else, whether it's a stakeholder or maybe somebody who's a little bit more on your level and kind of an ally, where you can just have a quick, maybe 5 to 10 minute touch base before the meeting, where you can just go over something. And that way, once you get to the meeting, instead of it feeling like a performance, it's really just a continuation of this conversation you already started. So that takes some pressure off. And then there's the meeting after the meeting. Jesus, it keeps going. But the question is, how does anything get executed? There's a pain point that's happening for everybody here of once the energy has been had in the meeting, where does it go? And so afterwards, following up with somebody, making sure that your voice is heard, if not necessarily during the meeting in the way that you wanted, but by email, right? That your point is taken by the person who needs to see it. So that will also hopefully relieve some pressure on the whole thing. The spotlight is in this condensed 45 minutes, and that is it. Like it's just one piece, kind of a 3-part puzzle.
I love that. I love that. I love also just the follow-up email. I think it's both personal, but also it shows the speaker that you have an interest in whatever they're doing. And maybe that might also open up a different window into potentially collaborating or pivoting to their field or area of whatever they're working on as a specialist and organically just creating and fostering a really natural close-knit relationship that just seems relevant, but also that just kind of falls naturally rather than feeling forced.
Exactly. And that goes off of what you said in the beginning of where you feel most comfortable is when it's smaller because that's where it's organic, right? So how do you, it's going to sound funny, but how do you manufacture the organic of it?
Yeah.
But it's not manufacturing, it's creating an environment in which you're just more comfortable. And so that's also remembering that these are people, and the best way to get what you want in life and to live the life you want, it's the relationships that you create, the relationships that you have with yourself and the relationships you have with people, okay, individuals. This will take time, but it is worth the investment, meaning if you haven't already, I have a feeling you have, but making sure that with all of these folks that are participating, you actually know them and what their goals are and how they communicate, so that if somebody is coming to the table in a way that maybe turns you off, if they're like a little bit blustery or it's not really your style, you have empathy for them. You know why they're like that, where they're coming from. It just happens to be their sort of coping mechanism, right? You've dissolved or diffused, again, all this sort of corporate pressure that gets added on that we then add more to it with the narrative that we create about that's just not my style. Okay, it's their style. This is how they're tackling the issue. I have a different style. I'm going to speak their language, but then show them how to speak mine. And to do that in a group setting with a lot of people with so much pressure, that's damn near impossible. It just isn't. So you came to me with a task that was the way that we were looking at it originally, that's hard to solve. But again, if you break it down to its components in the way that I did and add the component of these are literally just people. And if you know them
Mhm.
individually, now this is a different ball game. This is you're just having I don't know if it's a cocktail party instead of a meeting, but it's something that can feel a little bit more like a reunion of sorts, a celebration of sorts. It's just this gathering of different personalities all trying to solve problems as opposed to performance and solution. And that is it. So I don't know, based off of that, when you're reflecting on who was in the meeting, do you feel like there's more you could do to foster individual relationships? And then in doing that, A, you'll be more effective in the meeting, and B, you'll just get more done in general.
Yes, absolutely. I think also adjacent to that is spending even more time understanding each person's or each subcore team, whatever they're working on, and understanding what sort of their pain points. And by understanding what they're working on or their pain points, then you can thoughtfully ask questions that are related to their field and maybe even suggest ways on I've gathered insights from the customer side. And maybe that should be something that we should consider when evaluating the vendor side, for example. So adding feedback from that perspective, just building those relationships. So when then I'm in a larger team meetings, everyone, like you mentioned, is just someone you really know well, but also we're all humans at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're going to feel way more authentic doing this and you're going to get results really quickly. I feel like we solved a lot of this in a short period of time. But you tell me, you jump in. What else? Is there anything you want to talk through? How are you feeling? And I hope this was helpful for you, as I hope that it was.
This was a big topic, and I felt like there's a before and after session with you now of me. So yes, I felt like I learned a lot, and I have so many action steps that I am really excited to incorporate for the next meeting coming up.
Okay. I have to ask you though, will you report back and maybe we can do another, like just
Yes,
touch base? How did the
yes.
meeting go? By the way, this is all about steady growth. So just like I wanted to take the pressure off of having to solve problems or be the star of a meeting, same thing for yourself and how you are charting growth in your career, but also in life. So in this regard, you're going to have a lot of things you want to accomplish in this next meeting. Say, that's great. We love to have big aspirations, but out of all of them, what is the most important one? And one way to figure that out is asking yourself why. So if you have an instinct, okay, the most important on my list is this. Okay, why? Why? And then you, when asking yourself why a few times, actually, you might come to the conclusion, you know what? That's a little bit more about my ego, and that's not actually solving the problem, or it's not really about furthering a relationship, which is a stronger foundation and would be better to focus on. So just make that list for yourself, but take the pressure off, focusing on what's going to have the most impact, truly, and then build from there. So thank you, Summer, so much for being here today.
Thank you, Claire. This was life changing.